everywhere you turn, across the dial, and around the web. It's the same old boring chatter.
Russia! Ukraine! Russia! Impeach!
Until now. Broadcasting from high atop the hills of Dale. Hillsdale. Fighting for faith and freedom through the frequency of Radio Free Hillsdale. This is a fresh perspective. Here's Ryan Young and Ben Wilson.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Fresh Perspective. I'm Ryan Young.
And I'm Ben Wilson, and we're going to go live to our special guest for the show. Joining us now is Steve Sokup, the Vice President and Publisher of the Political Forum and author of his newest book, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, How Political Correctness Captured Big Business.
Hey, Steve, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's so great to have you on. This is such an important topic, and I look forward to diving into this with you. I want to ask, why did you write The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, and what was the motivation behind it?
Well, I've worked in the financial services world, and specifically at the nexus of financial services and politics for my entire professional career, which is 25 years now. And over the last 5 years or so, I'd noticed that while professional investors were less and less interested in political commentary and forecasting, the business itself was becoming more and more politicized, which I thought was an interesting paradox. And so as I started poking around and digging around, I learned a lot more than I probably wanted to about how deeply ingrained in the financial services business politics and a specific type of politics has become. Over the past couple of years, I've had some conversations with a few people who are intimately familiar with this. Justin Danhoff at the Free Enterprise Project opened my eyes quite a bit as to how deeply ingrained this is. And it was a shock to me, even though, as I say, I've been working at this nexus for 25 years.
Right.
When I shared that information with my clients, all of whom are large, serious, professional, institutional investors who've been around a long time, a lot of them were shocked too. So at that point, I decided that this is something that is important. It is something that very few people know about, and even those who know about it probably don't understand it as well as they should.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in your book, you talk about woke capital as a term. So what is that term, and what impact is it having on American businesses and culture?
Well, woke capital, the easiest way to define that is a top-down, anti-democratic strategy being employed by some of the biggest and most powerful names in American business to change American business, to change the definition of capitalism, and to change the very relationship between the citizen and the state.
Wow.
And the effect that that's having is pretty significant. We've seen the way this works just over the past couple of weeks in South Dakota and in Georgia, where very powerful corporations, either by actual threat of action or even just the perceived threat of action, can change the way the democratic process functions and can have a serious impact on the legislation and the regulation that our elected representatives feel comfortable enacting.
What were the examples that you were talking about there? I'm not sure I know.
Well, in South Dakota, Governor Noem has long been a huge advocate of this bill that the South Dakota legislature passed earlier this winter that would prevent transgender athletes from competing in athletic events that do not comport with their birth sex.
Right.
Essentially, this is a bill to protect female high school athletes from having to compete against those who were born biologically male. And after the legislature passed the bill, she got cold feet, and she backed off, and she hemmed and hawed, and she's still hemming and hawing. And a large part of the reason is because the Chamber of Commerce of the state and the various cities within South Dakota told her that they believed that this would cause a serious business backlash. We saw this type of backlash in North Carolina with HB2, the bathroom bill. We've seen it in Georgia, again with the bathroom bill and with an abortion bill. And she got cold feet because she was afraid that Amazon, in particular, which has promised to put a new warehouse in South Dakota and employ over 1,000 South Dakotans, she's worried that they will pull out of South Dakota, and this will damage the economy and it will damage the people she represents. So even without actually having to make a real threat, Amazon, because of its past behavior and because of the impact that they've had in previous situations, was able to change the way Governor Noem proceeded on this particular issue.
Wow. So it sounds to me like woke capital is very similar to cancel culture, except it goes even farther than just the social shunning, and it goes into the pocketbook of states and people, right?
Yeah, it certainly can.
Well, one of the things I wanted to get your take on was we've seen in recent years the more blatant and obvious indoctrination in Hollywood movies and these big companies. And I kind of want to break down actually what these major media companies control, so that way our listeners can kind of see that it just because there's so many channels available doesn't mean that we're being given different ideas. Because, I mean, Time Warner, for instance, owns CNN, TMZ, Cartoon Network, TBS, TNT, Sports Illustrated, People Magazine. Then we got Walt Disney, who controls ABC, ESPN, Pixar, Lucasfilms, NASCAR, Touchdown, Miramax. These boards of these companies really can control the entire thought for our nation. And I wanted to ask you, how are these companies really shaping our culture in a detrimental way?
Well, I think if you go back to, I believe it was C.S. Lewis, who said that the most important thing about forming our society and forming our next generation is we have to educate the little human animal. We have to teach him, and we have to reinforce the virtues that we believe are most important. And the way historically that we've always reinforced those virtues is through the stories we tell our children, the stories we read to them, the fables we pass down, and more recently through the television shows, the movies, et cetera, that we allow them to watch. And as you say, there is a very small number of people, a very small number of companies deciding all of that for all of us today, and essentially hiding the fact that they're slipping in various politicized messages into what they show us. And so this is a very serious issue. It's a very real issue, but it's an issue that very few people give much thought to. Disney is one of the companies that I single out in the book as being a particularly disingenuous woke player. And Disney's former chairman, Bob Iger, is a liberal icon. He is, a very nice man. He's a very social justice-oriented man. He's very environmentally friendly. He and Steve Jobs were pals for a long time. They share the same sort of political ethos. And yet he's also deeply, heavily invested in the People's Republic of China. And like most large Hollywood entertainment companies, what Disney produces is directly impacted by the desires and wishes of the Chinese Communist Party.
Wow.
Because China, being the second largest market in the world and the most aggressive about asking these companies not to portray their country in a bad light, the Chinese Communist Party has a great deal of influence over what we see and what our culture is allowed to inculcate the future generations with.
Yeah, these big business companies, they're the most hypocritical of them all. Like what you were just saying, what comes to my mind is Nike. I mean, they're promoting the whole social justice in our nation, equality for all, which isn't a bad thing. But then they're like having slave labor in sweatshops in China making our tennis shoes. I mean, hold on, you know?
Yeah, and Nike just the other day, I believe, said that it would try not to use cotton harvested in Xinjiang province in China in its products any longer because of the likelihood that cotton was harvested using slave labor. And the blowback they got immediately from the People's Republic of China suggests to me that A, they hit a nerve, and B, they're not going to follow through with this. That if they try to follow through with this, that they will lose the competitive advantage that they believe they have in the PRC, and will probably back off in order to save that relationship.
Yeah, they're spineless.
Yeah, they are. Switching gears, you talk about in your new book, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, you talk about the ESG movement. What is it, and what are its impacts?
ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance, and it is, without question, the hottest investment trend in the United States and in Europe over the past, say, 5 years. The investment bank Cowen just last week released its numbers estimating that roughly 1 in 4 American dollars invested today is invested in an ESG product, which is a huge, huge development just to have taken place basically over the last 5 or 10 years. ESG is essentially the successor investment idea to what used to be called socially responsible investing. Socially responsible investing was an outgrowth of the student protests against the government of South Africa and the demands that these students made that their universities, their institutions defund the apartheid government in South Africa, that they would withdraw all of their funds from companies that did business in South Africa. And socially responsible investing was essentially a very benign, bipartisan, unintrusive way of investing. If you were willing to give up a certain percentage of your return on investment to make sure that your investments aligned with your values, then you could do so. Nobody forced you to do anything. Nobody forced the companies to do anything. You just screened the companies that you disagreed with their values. You screened them out of your portfolio. ESG is different. ESG is very aggressive and is very coercive. Instead of screening companies out of portfolios, what ESG tries to do is to change the way companies behave, harnessing the shareholder proposal process and annual meetings and annual proxy statements that companies have to put out. Activist shareholders have attempted, in many cases successfully, to pressure companies to change their practices, to change their views, to change their plans for the future. And when those companies won't change, now that the ESG movement has grown so significant and has grown so powerful, these activist investors now have the power to change the management and change the board of directors at companies that are resistant and force them to agree with their largely politicized version of business.
Mm-hmm. So is this movement, I mean, is this sustainable? What's the end? Where is this going to go within the next 5, 10, 20 years?
I do not believe that it is sustainable. I believe that it is in part a function of the fact that our markets are being largely propped up by the Fed and by eternally easy money, and that at some point in the future, when the investment environment grows a little more difficult, that there will be some losses. Misallocation of capital is misallocation of capital. It doesn't matter if you misallocate it because of corruption or if you misallocate it because of political beliefs. Any misallocation will eventually be sniffed out by the market, and it will cause, the underlying issue to collapse. In this case, the problem is that with $1 in $4 invested in ESG, and a lot of that coming from mom and pop retail investors through their 401ks, through their IRAs, through their small investment accounts, when that bubble pops, it's going to have a really, really significant impact on a lot of people who are counting on those funds for their retirement. And I think it's going to get very ugly very fast.
So what's the time frame on that? I mean, do you have a guess of when things like that will start to...
Yeah, well, that it depends on how long the global market is willing to tolerate the Federal Reserve running the printing presses 24 hours a day. Eventually, one presumes anyway, that the eternal easy money that we've had in this country since at least 2008, since the crash then, will have to stop. And when it does, if I could tell you when that would be, we could all make a lot of money. But when that stops, and when the bubble pops, then it will be very, as I said, very bloody.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're listening to A Fresh Perspective on Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7. We are with Steve Sokup, author of The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. Steve, you're talking about the ESG movement. It's unsustainable, and we're going to see a lot of impacts on it. And you touched on retirement funds being affected. So what, taking these broad concepts and applying it to our listeners, what are the impacts that the everyday American is going to see from this movement, from woke capital, on their day-to-day life? And who are the major actors that are really pushing these impacts onto the everyday American?
Well, the problem with woke capital is it's like the proverbial onion. You peel a layer, and there's another layer, and then you peel that layer, and there's another layer, and it goes on and on. The impact that this is having, and that it can have, and that it will have, is enormous, and I don't think we even understand. I don't think we even grasp just how significant it will be, it can be. It affects everything from free speech on social media to future ability to retire on invested funds, to the abilities of state governments to enact legislation that they believe is in the interest of their residents and their citizens. So it's a vast web of effects that it is having on our society today, and will continue to have until we can push back against it somehow.
Yeah, well, you provided a couple examples a little bit earlier, but I wanted to give another one for our listeners. In your book specifically, you said, quote, specifically several large media companies, Disney, Netflix, and Warner Media, had begun a campaign to punish the people of Georgia by crippling the state's economy. Why? Because the elected representatives of the people had passed a law in keeping with the values and beliefs of the state's residents to restrict abortion after a fetal heartbeat could be detected. Could you just explain that example a little bit more for us? And really, what can we do to ensure that this type of indoctrination and punishment that's taking place isn't going to continue?
Sure. The story of Georgia and its fetal abortion, or its fetal heartbeat law, probably begins about 2 decades ago, when the government of Georgia, across both Republican and Democratic administrations, began investing in the entertainment industry and trying to lure large entertainment companies to Georgia to produce films, to set up offices there to create jobs for Georgians. And it's been a very successful campaign. At this point, there's roughly 100,000 Georgians who are employed in the entertainment industry. And that's not, Hollywood stars who've moved to Georgia. That's just normal, average, everyday Georgians, 100,000 people.
Wow.
In 2019, the center-right legislature of the center-right state of Georgia passed a fetal heartbeat law, or a fetal heartbeat bill. And then the center-right governor of the center-right state of Georgia went to sign the law. And these media companies, these entertainment companies, threw an absolute fit. Bob Iger, again of Disney, was one of the leaders of this, saying he did not see how it would be possible for Disney to continue work in the state of Georgia.
Wow.
Now, given what we know about how Georgia has invested in bringing entertainment business jobs to the state. What that was a direct threat to the livelihoods of 100,000 Georgians. And by extension, it was a direct threat to the economic well-being of the state. So what essentially these media companies were saying was, do what we say, or we will put 100,000 people out of work and we will tank your state economy. That's an awful lot of power and an awful position for private industry to be in with respect to the government.
Yes, it really is. We're running out of a little bit of time. I just wanted to get this final question in. What can we do to fight back against this, to make us stand and say we've had enough of this dictatorship?
Well, that's going to vary from group to group. Investors will fight back one way. Consumers will fight back another way. Students can fight back a different way. Mm-hmm. But the most important thing is to understand the problem, to understand who's causing the problem and why they're causing the problem, and then to engage with them. That's the thing that I want to emphasize, is we have to engage. Abandoning this playing space to the other side would be just to give up and to allow them to take over. So we need to engage. We don't need to disengage and boycott. We need to get, basically reverse engineer what they've done in order to bring back American business to a position of neutrality.
Thank you so much, Steve, for coming on. You've been listening to A Fresh Perspective with our guest, Steve Sokup, Vice President and Publisher of the Political Forum and author of The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, How Political Correctness Captured Big Business. For more information about the book, visit Amazon.com. Thanks again, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
You've been listening to A Fresh Perspective. I'm Ryan Young.
I'm Ben Wilson.
Have a wonderful week.
We'll see you next time.